Welcome to the Pure Insight Web Seminar Series. Today's e-learning webinar is entitled Project Portfolio Management, and it will look at how to go about moving from value creation to value maximization. The session is led by Dr. Richard Bainey. Richard is a 23-year veteran of the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry, having worked prior at Merck & Co., Bayer, Bristol Myers Squibb, and as Vice President of Portfolio Management and Decision Analysis at Johnson & Johnson. During this time, he spent 11 years building and leading departments in strategic planning, decision analysis, and portfolio management, as well as 2 years as an international program manager for a marketed cardiovascular drug. He is a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania, where he lectures in decision modeling and portfolio management, and is a frequent industry speaker in portfolio and resource management, risk analysis and management, and strategic planning. He is also an advisory board member to Cambridge Health Tech Institute and has an MSc and PhD degree from the University of London and an MBA from Columbia University, as well as a PMP qualification from the Project Management Institute. Richard's webinar looks into how companies can sometimes unwittingly destroy portfolio value by adopting inferior portfolio selection and prioritization techniques. Making use of insights from experience and a walk-through step-by-step example, the session will look at how to maximize the value of a project or program portfolio subject to the budgetary and human resource constraints that affect your business on an ongoing basis. In particular, it will look at how to ensure that the sum of your projects represents the highest value that can be created, or, to put it another way, how you make the very best utilization of your existing resources. Discussing why good strategic planning and goal setting are prerequisites to the effective management of an asset's portfolio, Richard will introduce a framework for use in both highly innovative and less innovative pipeline environments, covering the topics of portfolio categorisation, risk analysis, evaluation, optimization and prioritization, and management. By attending, it's our aim that you will learn how to translate high-level strategic or financial goals into quantifiable goals that lend themselves to objective setting, a systematic and defensible approach to effective and efficient portfolio management, as well as how to optimize the value of a portfolio of assets and utilize the recommended solution as a basis for portfolio selection and decision-making. As ever, the content and recording of this e-learning webinar is copyrighted material. Any rebroadcast or unauthorized reproduction of the material is strictly prohibited. Richard, over to you.
So good morning or good afternoon, everyone, wherever you may be. The intent of today's webinar is to provide detail around project portfolio management in the context of maximizing value to the portfolio and not simply creating portfolio value, using a framework that is called CREOPM, that I will describe in subsequent slides. Mark has already described my background, and all that I need to state here is that over the last 15 years or so, I have been responsible for building and creating portfolio management departments across several different organizations within the pharma and biotech industry. However, I hasten to add that the methodology that I'm about to present is not only applicable to high-risk industries such as drug development and, for example, oil refining. The methodology is just as applicable to low-risk industries such as consumer goods, information technology, and risk insurance. So here's a modest agenda for the next 45 or 50 minutes. There's an outline that will look at the hierarchical relationships between projects, programs, and portfolios. And before I start talking about portfolio management, I generally like to place things in their appropriate context. Most of us have come from a project management background or have delved in that domain of expertise at some point in time in our professional careers, but it helps me to reaffirm the interrelationships between projects, programs, and portfolios. Now, before I begin a discussion on portfolio management, the context in which I place it is to have a thorough understanding of what it means to apply good portfolio management in the context of good strategic planning and good business planning. So that is the second bullet under understanding. Well, thirdly, I'll describe a novel portfolio management framework that is, the acronym is CREOPM, C-R-E-O-P-M, and I will discuss that in much more detail later on. We will look at quantification of portfolio value, and as Mark's already alluded to, there are companies that unwittingly destroy portfolio value by selecting their portfolios through a rather popular methodology and process that we've come to understand as project prioritization. Well, using exactly the same data and information, I'll show you how we can actually maximize portfolio value by conducting portfolio selection using a different methodology that's simply called portfolio optimization. Now, many of you on the line have probably heard the terms prioritization and optimization used rather interchangeably. Unfortunately, these are not interchangeable terms, and I'll show you the delta, which I call the portfolio delta, and that refers to the value that organizations unknowingly leave on the table by selecting projects to their portfolio using prioritization, which is a rather inferior technique, and I hope to be able to convince most, if not all of you, before the end of the session today. I will look at a portfolio management capability maturity model building diagnostic tool that I've created, and we will look at that in the context of the current state of organizations, where they wish to go, which I call the desired state, and how one may create multi-period transitional plans, multi-generational plans to be able to close those gaps. Lastly, I have a modest slide on my experiences over the last decade and a half building portfolio management organizations in 3 rather stellar pharma and biotech organizations, and latterly over the past 5 years doing the very same across a wider breadth of industry sectors. Now, moving beyond project management to program and portfolio management, this is a triple constraint that we're all aware of in the context of project management. My affirmation of what I do or help others to do in the area of portfolio management has nothing to do with the triple constraint. The triple constraint of scope, time, and cost are merely good metrics, good vehicles to allow us to do good project management. But when we cross the chasm between project management and portfolio management through oftentimes program management, we look at 3 rather different objectives or metrics, one being strategic alignment, the other being value maximization, whether you're a for-profit or not-for-profit organization, and the other one looking at temporal balance. Temporal balance obviously being most important to an ongoing concern when you're looking at your ability to maximize value while you are strategically oriented or aligned in the short term, the midterm, as well as the long term. Portfolio strategy connectivity at the middle tier of, in fact, of this pyramid is most important to me. Doesn't and can't stand on its own. It is very dependent on corporate objectives that are hopefully defined on a multi-period basis, and the portfolio strategy necessary to support those corporate objectives on an ongoing basis must in turn be supported by your R&D and business investment strategy. So the temporal orientation is your corporate objectives being represented by your strategic plan. For some of us, that's a 5-year, a 10-year, a 15-year plan. Next, your portfolio plan to support your strategic plan. And last of all, your business plan in support of your portfolio plan that in turn supports your corporate plan or strategic plan. Now, unfortunately, in many organizations, large and small, successful and not so successful, we tend to begin with the business plan, that annual event that actually forecasts the resourcing needs of the organization over the next 12, 18 to 24 months. Now, I actually train folks and organizations to not begin with the business plan. The business plan is only as good as the context in which it is placed, and that context is the strategic plan that is then supported by the portfolio plan. This is not about tools and techniques, methodologies, systems, and software or models. This is about having good strategic planning that is supported by good portfolio planning, and at the bottom tier of the pyramid, in fact, also supported by excellent business planning. Now, if I take the previous slide and I model that in another context, looking at portfolio objectives that is supported by program objectives or by project objectives, we clearly have to start somewhere, and the place we start is at the project level, doing the best we can for projects. Some of those projects may or may not roll up into programs, and some of those programs will obviously be dependent on projects. Okay, but then essentially everything, both projects and programs, essentially constitute your portfolio objectives. Now, to the framework that I alluded to, CREOPAM. CREOPAM, to me, is a rather simple framework. Note the source at the bottom. By the way, myself and my co-author, Ram Chakravarti from the University of Pennsylvania, where I teach as an adjunct. And just to let you know that, so that you can gain much more information, post this webinar, our first textbook that describes CREOPAM in its infinite detail is supposed to be published at the end of this month. So CREOPAM is a unique framework for portfolio management that begins with categorization, which I will describe. Then we move to the analysis of risk. We evaluate in an integrated manner. We optimize the portfolio, so we are selecting the best portfolio through optimization and then prioritizing in the framework of an optimized portfolio, not prioritizing first and then optimizing later. And then lastly, in this chain of events, we manage the portfolio on an ongoing basis. So what does this all mean? Well, categorization looks at discretionary from non-discretionary projects. Discretionary projects are those may-dos. They really ought to be the focus of your portfolio management activities on an ongoing basis. Must-dos are really non-discretionary projects. You don't answer the question, do we do these projects? The only question you really ask is when may we do these projects, not if we do them. Now, whether we wish to acknowledge them publicly or otherwise, in fact, every portfolio that I've encountered has won't-dos. Projects that are legacy items, whether you're in R&D or IT, projects that really have lost both their strategic and financial value, but because of sunk cost, they exist in our portfolio. I try to apply the best degree of rigor and discipline possible to remove won't-dos from the portfolio so that those resources can be added back to the may-do or discretionary bucket. Next, the analysis of risk, and I first of all delineate what is controllable from what is not controllable. If stuff is largely controllable, then I don't imply that those need to be part of the risk assessment. If you can have that risk be mitigated or minimized or simply go away by the application of greater resources, then don't burden your projects and your portfolio down with controllable risk assessments. The evaluation is based on what I call BRCT or VRCT, V being for value. Nevertheless, it's the integration of benefit, risk, cost, and time into an integrated risk-adjusted valuation. More often than not, I use risk-adjusted net present value or expected net present value. The E for decision analysts obviously refers to risk-adjusted. Through optimization, I apply two different techniques. Now, please don't be thrown by the technical jargon here. Linear programming and stochastic programming. These simply refer to very old-fashioned methodologies, and once you can develop a spreadsheet, there is good software that actually does this type of analysis for you in anything from a half of a second to a couple of seconds, depending on the complexity of your model. Within the context of the optimized portfolio, I then do prioritization. Now, some of you may use different methodologies to prioritize your projects for portfolio selection. You may use the analytical hierarchy process or pairwise comparisons. That is not a favorite technique of mine. I use MODA, and MODA refers to multiple objective decision analysis. That I will describe in a few later slides. Then I eventually help others manage their portfolios, managing risk, resources, their stakeholders, and looking at capability maturity levels. Now, what I'll do is go through each of these 6 elements reasonably quickly before I get to the case study, because the case study will really bring together, in fact, 2 of the many seminal elements that refer to optimization and prioritization, but I can't just describe those 2 elements without looking at the context of CREOPA. So let's start with categorize. I've already spoken about this. Must-do projects are really non-discretionary projects that really should be the equivalent of what we call in binary integer language ones, as opposed to zeros. Zeros should be won't do's, meaning you won't do them. They shouldn't be, in fact, integrated in your portfolio. Your must-do's are ones. Your may-do's may be zeros or ones. That is to say, you may not do them or do them. And really, that middle bucket of projects, as you categorize your projects, ought to be the focus of ongoing portfolio management. So most of my time is spent not looking at the must-dos or the won't-dos, but looking at the may-do projects, those discretionary projects again. But to get to the may-dos, one has to go through the first and third filters. That is, what is it that we're obligated to do? Something could be of a regulatory or compliance nature. What we won't do, so for example, a legacy project that has lost its strategic and financial value, then let's focus on the may-dos. That explains categorization. The analysis of risk, my intent is to look at largely uncontrollable risk factors for quantification using judgmental probabilities. So risk could be private or inherent risk. There are external risks, such as the FDA or EMA in Europe. There are operational risks, largely controllable, and then there's other. That could refer to political risk or environmental risk or most other risks, for which we really have no control. This is the way that I break down controllable from uncontrollable risks, and in the analysis of the risk, what I then do is to focus on those elements that are largely uncontrollable, not the controllable risk. For example, the operational risk that one can spend a lot of time talking about and quantifying, but really it ought not to be very seminal to a risk assessment. That is because that risk can be made to largely disappear as a consequence of actually applying greater resources, meaning people or budget. Evaluation, I spoke about this in terms of an integrated evaluation. That is the integration of benefit or risk, or value, risk, cost and time, and that generates an expected or a risk-adjusted value. No more needs to be said on that slide at this moment. Now, optimize. What do I mean by optimize? It is this selection of the best combination, highlighted here in red, of projects and programs to maximize value within your portfolio. This is not about rank ordering. This is a methodology that is oriented to finding the best combination of projects without exceeding your constraints, whether they be budgetary or human constraints. They meet your requirements. For example, we need to launch at least 2 new products every year or 3 new molecular entities every other year. Those are the types of constraints we have. It is really a system that makes the most effective use of an economic good. Now, here's the first question I'll ask anyone in the audience. So what does this line here actually represent, this line in blue? Those of you with an economics background will recognize this immediately. So there's a response from someone that says the cumulative value, that to some extent, is correct. That line, however, is most popularly known in the world of economics as the efficient frontier. And that is the context in which optimization is done. Optimization looks at that best combination of projects, best combination of projects that helps to maximize value, by getting as close to or on the efficient frontier without exceeding a budgetary constraint, a human resource constraint, or exceeding a certain level of risk. So I'll ask you folks to just place at the back of your minds the efficient frontier for portfolio optimization as I go further through this webinar. However, that is the context of optimization. The best combination of projects, not rank ordering. Now that we have actually selected the best combination of projects, how do we rank order them, and why do we need to rank order? Well, we obviously have constrained resources, and we may need to develop a prioritization system where we do project A before B or C before D because we have budgetary, human, manufacturing constraints, one or other. Nevertheless, prioritization in its essence is really about selecting projects based on rank ordering and rank ordering alone. Well, this has nothing to do with the selection of the best combination of projects to maximize value. It just says let's rank them based on one or other metric and see how they stack up. So it really is a method that determines the right to precedence if we look at the third definition here. A right to precedence, meaning a right to gain resources before others. In this case, though you can't see the graphic very well, project A is at the top. That would imply that one should do project A before you do other projects. Now, the real question is, should project A actually be a part of your optimal portfolio to begin with? That I want you to also remember. Now, the last bit of the acronym of CREOPM, manage. Clearly, we need to do ongoing risk management. Looking at your organizational and your governance decision-making risk preferences. But we need to be mindful of resource management on an ongoing basis, where you look at what's already committed for projects that are in flight and what may be discretionary resources to allocate to projects that are at the margin, meaning those that really are discretionary projects. Clearly, there's an ongoing need to satisfy the needs and expectations of your stakeholders. And lastly, you ought to look on an ongoing basis at where you are in terms of your own capability, maturity, evolution, and seeing where gaps are along one or other dimension so that you can try to close those gaps through good transitions. Now, that ends a description of CREOPM. Generally, when I do this to an audience, and clearly you're not live, I ask questions about, will this apply to your organization and can it be successfully implemented? Well, the types of answers I generally get, and the first one is clearly one that I have come to live with, no way in hell. This is far too complex and management won't ever buy in. We use common sense and good judgment. Next, I hear data and priorities change far too quickly to use a framework like this. I also hear the data and information are too imperfect to use in these types of analysis. No one's ever told me, by the way, that the data and information that are imperfect are too imperfect to be used to prioritize their projects. So we can prioritize on any types of data and information that are imperfect, yet when we go to a more rigorous and disciplined portfolio management process, as I've described in CREOPM, we tend to shy away by the default mechanism that says, no, can't do it because the data and information are too imperfect. Next, and I'm sure that some of you on the line have been victims of this, we're not yet ready for this type of discipline, or we're restructuring yet again. And I also hear that we're ready to build or improve on this type of discipline to some extent in the minority, though of course there are some folks who say yes, we need to make a start, and if we don't get started now, things will never happen. So now I will go to the case study. There's a question, by the way, that I've just seen show up. Okay, that says, how do you cope with inaccuracies in financial data that can influence portfolio optimization and or prioritization? Excellent question. Well, the problem is that all data are inaccurate. So what I would do for data, whether financial or otherwise, that are inaccurate is in fact create a range estimate. not a deterministic point estimate, because you know it's wrong, a range estimate but with a defined level of confidence that then allows you to actually create an estimated mean from that defined level of confidence. That's the best amount of time I can spend on that right now. But if, in fact, you're uncertain about the accuracy of your data, don't use a point estimate. Use a range with a defined level of confidence, probably 90–95%, then create an estimated mean. Another question, important point in such a methodology and discipline requires a high level of knowledge of portfolio management in general. We need to start somewhere. It is most important, to start with what the corporate objectives are. That is, what is the strategic plan? Once we know what the strategic plan is, we can put in place those building blocks that will allow us to gain greater access to portfolio management knowledge and, in fact, to build our own capabilities. This is not a framework that says, well, I have to know everything about portfolio management before I implement it. Not at all. In fact, of the 6 elements in the acronym CREOPM, there are organizations that say to me, I will only do prioritization in year 1, then if I get traction with my governance, then I'll go to optimization, then I apply some other sophisticated tools. You don't have to apply all 6 of these elements at once in any organization. Last question I'll take before moving on, option values. Yes, I apply decision analysis using decision trees to look at the value of investing in a particular phase of development of a project and then looking at the option value that is created in doing so. That can also be a part of your optimization frame. Now, especially in high-risk industries, clearly, one needs to look at option values as that is most critical. We rarely ever go into an investment saying it's all or nothing. We need to look at staged investments to the extent we can. We learn something from, in fact, a modest investment, and then we try to confirm what we learn with a major investment. That's the approach that I take. So I thank the person who asked about option values very much. That is always an important question in portfolio management. It is rarely ever all or nothing in terms of investment. Good. Now let's look at company XYZ. And let's look at the 2 techniques that I applied. That's the O and the P, the O for optimization, the P for prioritization, then look at how we select our portfolios. Now here's a company that has a portfolio of 10 projects and has a real problem of riches. So it has limited capital and human resources to support the entire portfolio. So here we see that we have 10 projects in the leftmost column. We don't know whether to select or not select. If you selected all, making them ones, then you would get a stropping $6.245 billion of AMA value. That would be great, except that very few of us are able to essentially afford everything in our portfolio. So what we have is that we are limited by 65 discoverers. I've tried to make this an easy problem. We're also limited by 40 developers, and we only have $1.5 billion, in fact, in our annual budget. Okay, let's pretend it's this year or next year. What is required of the portfolio, however, to get everything done, is we need 68 discoverers, we need 60 developers, and we need $2.5 billion of AMA budget, which unfortunately we don't have, so we are rather constrained. Now again, if we were to actually do the entire portfolio, we would gain $6.55 billion of AMA value, but we can't afford every project. So what would you advise company XYZ to do? Well, not surprisingly, most folks say, well, let's prioritize. Okay, let's prioritize and see how far we get. Now, we're prioritizing a net present value, because that is the value that, in fact, we are measuring our portfolio on. That's the estimated net present value. Note that project E actually has a value of $900 million, so we would expect prioritization to place project E at the very top, and indeed it does. So in terms of ranking these projects, doing good old-fashioned prioritization, you essentially end up with a schema that says E before D, then J, then A, then C, all the way through to H. Good. Now the CFO comes along, draws the line and says, thou shalt not do anything below A. Why is that? Well, let's look at why. Oh, if we did E, D, J, and A, you've already got to $1.475 billion in budget. And what was our budgetary constraint? 1.5. We can't afford any other projects. Luckily, we're not exceeding our discoverers. We're not exceeding our developers. So this looks like a rather good portfolio. So that portfolio gives us a value of $3.195 billion. It is a good portfolio. Look, the portfolio says, do projects E, D, J, and A, but you can't do any of the other 6 projects because you will have exceeded at least your capital constraint. So I'll ask you to make a mental note of $3.195 billion. Now let's try to optimize the portfolio instead of prioritizing. We're now looking for the best combination of projects. Now look at what we have here under the selection mechanism. Instead of, whereas we had in the previous slide, 4 projects being done and 6 not being done, here with optimization we have 7 projects being done, that's why they show up as 1s, and 3 projects not being done, that's why they show up as 0s. Now, do they exceed our constraints? No, because they only require 42 discoverers. They only require 38 developers, not exceeding our constraints, and less than the 1.5. So this is a very actionable portfolio, which, by the way, gives us nearly $4 billion of portfolio value. Now, what's the difference? The difference between portfolio selection by prioritization in the previous slide that yielded $3.195 billion and portfolio optimization in this current slide that leads us to 3.995 is a whopping 0.8 billion or $800 million in portfolio value. That's the portfolio delta that you would have walked away from if you had been satisfied by prioritizing projects for portfolio selection as opposed to, in fact, optimizing the portfolio and selecting a different combination of projects. Now let me move to the next slide and put this in its appropriate context. What would you rather do? Would you rather actually optimize or prioritize the portfolio? This is what the optimization tells us, and that comes from the previous slide. It says don't do 2 of the top 4 projects, E and J, that you would have done if you had been satisfied with prioritization. Now imagine that if you didn't do any form of optimization and you had just done prioritization, you would have done E, D, J, and A and not done anything below A. That's in the previous slide. That would have yielded you 3.195. You do a different methodology using, by the way, the same data that's imperfect and uncertain. No need to do anything else any different. You're using the same data and you generate $800 million more. Now, to me, it doesn't matter whether you're generating $800 million more or $80 million more or $8 million more or $8 more. Would you knowingly walk away from that portfolio delta in value if you could use a different methodology to create greater value? So, would you prioritize projects leading to an aggregate portfolio value of 3.195, or would you optimize the portfolio to give you an additional 800 million? Most of you, I believe, okay, would tell me quite rationally, you would not want to forego $800 million in your portfolio, and you'd rather optimize as opposed to prioritize. Now, what type of magic am I applying that is giving me $800 million more? In fact, there is no magic whatsoever. This is exactly the efficient frontier that I described in an earlier slide. Oh, but optimization is so much more superior to prioritization that we would have created portfolio A, which is the equivalent of our prioritized portfolio. That for the same level of budget, let's just remove this x-axis, and instead of calling it risk, let's just call it budget. It's a constraint. So for a fixed constraint of, let's say, $1.5 billion for a given year, we could have generated portfolio C, which is the portfolio we just generated through optimization, leading us to a portfolio delta of $800 million more, using optimization to get us on the efficient frontier and not using prioritization, which would have given us an inferior portfolio. So the way to look at this is to do the following. One would say that portfolio C is a dominant portfolio over portfolio A because it maximizes portfolio value, which is what you see here. The maximization of portfolio value that's on the efficient frontier, whereas portfolio A is a suboptimal portfolio because it does not maximize value. Portfolio B, by the way, is a better portfolio than portfolio A because for the same level of reward here, you basically could be spending a hell of a lot less or taking on a lot less risk than if you were looking at portfolio A. So both portfolios C and B dominate portfolio A. That is the economic concept of the efficient frontier. Quick question I have is, do you treat projects that are already halfway in the same way as may do's? That is an excellent question. So projects that are already halfway are in flight. Those are projects that you are committed to. Those projects need to continue at least until the end of that specific phase of development. They are no longer discretionary projects. They are must-do projects because you are part of the way through the project at least until the next phase of development, where you will decide, hopefully, at your stage gate review process. Okay, very good. So let me move on to the next slide. Now, you've seen these 5 not unreasonable objections. Now, the one I generally get is, we're different. We don't make decisions on financial data only. We use strategic and other criteria. Okay, let's go to the application of other criteria. This is not only just going to be based on net present value. Now, before I go there, I see a question that's just arrived. Okay, and it says, if we think of the stage gate process, projects are often quite open at the early phase. We don't know what we're doing until later. Do I suggest only including projects that have passed a certain stage of development? Another excellent question. Now, here's what I'll do in 30 seconds. Projects ought to be divided. Okay, if I use conventional high-risk development, I do a discovery phase, then I do a true concept phase, and then I do a later mature phase. Now, if I'm in drug development, I call that research, clinical development, and regulatory phases. I would actually distinguish between those 3 buckets within my portfolio and do 3 different sets of optimizations followed by 3 different sets of prioritizations, and not commingle my research projects with my later development projects. The reason I say that is because if you commingle your early concept ideas with your projects that are much later and much more mature, guess which projects will always be bumped out of the portfolio? Your research projects that are low in value and high in risk because you don't know enough about them. So my answer to the question again is, try to find a way to actually delineate and segregate your entire portfolio into roughly 3 buckets. Your early ideas, your later ideas, and then your most mature ideas. Okay, in drug development, that would be research, clinical development, and regulatory prior to launch. Okay, now let's go back to this. It's the same company XYZ that says, we don't like doing it only in NPV. We'll use a number of different metrics, both qualitative and quantitative. Now, actually, a good qualitative metric is not surprisingly strategic value. So we could look at strategic value and make that a parameter or a metric that one would use for quantifying value, and therefore helping projects be prioritized or optimized. In this case, I've simply chosen 4 major metrics. These are benefit, risk, cost, and time. Now, just to make this easy, I've broken each of these major metrics into 2 sub-attributes. For example, benefit can be quantified in terms of actual financial value and strategic value. The others speak for themselves. Now, not surprisingly, I've got to create some type of scoring system and a weighting system that results in a weighted aggregate score. And here comes MODA. This is what I described much earlier. MODA is multiple objective decision analysis. These are my objectives. Clearly, I want to maximize benefit. I'd like to minimize risk and cost and minimize time to market. It depends on what your objectives are. The way that I will measure these is through these 2 sub-attributes per major attribute. So in total, I have 8 sub-attributes that I will use to score and consequently rank or optimize my projects. Now, just so you know, what I've described here is not only applicable to high risk. This is a rather low-risk model that has been severely masked. And this is the type of MODA model I would use, for example, in the IT world. But when folks come to me and say they have a lot of projects, some discretionary, non-discretionary, some in flight, some not yet started, how do we prioritize projects? I use the same type of MODA model. Now, here's what a baby MODA model in Excel looks like. These are the same 4 major attributes. Benefit, risk, cost, and time, and these are broken out by their sub-attributes. And all I have here are projects that are scored on each one of the sub-attributes. Now, how do we get to the score? Well, we need to generate something that's given a fanciful name and called a utility function. We're no longer in the world of financial value or non-financial value. We have to place everything in a common playing field, and that is utility. So I have to create a utility function for financial value, and here is a different utility function for R&D cost. Note, the greater my value, the greater my numerical score that I get. So this is a nonlinear ascending function. It actually looks a bit sigmoid. And not surprisingly for R&D cost, the less I spend, then in fact the greater value I create. So if, in fact, my R&D cost is very high, I expect to have a lower numerical score than if my R&D cost is very low, in which case I expect to have a higher score. This is just a conventional utility function, nothing novel to anyone on the phone, I am most convinced. So we prioritize projects on those 8 scored and weighted aggregate sub-attributes. And here's what the prioritization looks like. Now note we have a different combination of projects. J, D, F, and C. Previously, for those who may remember, it was E, D, J, and A before the red line appeared. Now we have J, D, F, and C. We shouldn't be surprised because we're actually prioritizing by a completely different mechanism. Now I eyeballed this chart and said clearly we do the 4 above the line, but I can squeak in 2 other projects, G and H, just by eyeballing. That gives me, in fact, an aggregate NPV of 3620, and no, I'm not exceeding my developers or discoverers, and certainly not exceeding my budgetary constraint of 1.5 billion. So it's now 3.62. Can I do any better? Can I create greater value for the portfolio by looking at optimization using the same data, no longer just NPV, using the same multi-criteria data and putting it in a different mathematical form? Well, in fact, I can using optimization. Now I optimize and, this little schema tells me that I need to do 7 projects, not do 3. Previously, that slide said, in fact, let's do 5 projects, actually 6 projects and not do 4. And this says do a different combination of 7 and not do 3. And lo and behold, I can generate 3.9 billion. Now the difference between the value creation using portfolio prioritization getting me to 3.62 and the value maximization using optimization, which is 3.9, is 0.28 of a billion or $208 million. So again, whether it's 280 million, 28 million, 2.8 million, or $2.8, I want to maximize that portfolio value because I don't want to leave money on the table. I hate leaving value anywhere. Let it go straight to my portfolio. So I generally ask the question, so how do you feel about this now? We've described CREOPM. We've done prioritization and optimization and NPV only, and you've probably said, well, we don't just use financial value. We use a multitude of values. I've just done it, and we've been able to beat prioritization using multiple criteria by using optimization using multiple criteria. Well, most people's last resort is this. We're really different. We don't make decisions on financial data only or on strategic and other criteria. We just use good judgment. Well, folks, if that is the response of anyone on the call, CREOPM is not for you, or any other portfolio management methodology, by the way. If good judgment is all that is applied in the absence of good analytics, not to supplement good judgment, but to complement good judgment using good analytics and a good disciplined approach to portfolio management, then this would not be the methodology for you to follow. All right, what I'm going to do is, in fact, in the interest of time, there are only 9 minutes left. And so far, I've taken every question that has come forth in the chat box. Let me just move ahead to the end of the presentation, just a few more slides, and then I will pause for about 3-4 minutes of questions. So, portfolio management capability maturity models. I use this, in fact, to assist organizations to first diagnose where they are, and then, in fact, to evaluate where they'd like to get to. Looking at the delta, that is to say the gap analysis between the current state and the desired state, and then ask the question, so what types of annual or multi-generational portfolio management transition plans do you wish to put in place to close those gaps? Well, the only way you'll know what gaps you need to close is, in fact, evaluate where you are. Now, this is not an atypical capability maturity model developed at Carnegie Mellon. I cannot take credit for having developed this uniquely or on my own. This was a model that was created elsewhere academically. I've simply adapted it to my line of work. You start with a capability maturity model level 1, and that basically tells you you're at what is called an informal level. I'll describe that later on. You go to desired state, in fact, a defined level, or governed, manage, and eventually you end up at CMM level 5, which is an optimized state. Now, what does that mean in fact, just in terms of a rather modest synopsis? Well, at the informal level, you recognize the benefits of applying portfolio management as a discipline, but you don't do a whole hell of a lot about it. You move to CMM level 2, where you actually create a portfolio to communicate relationships between projects, including those non-discretionary mandates. You then move to a higher level called governed, of the requirement of the portfolio management to be recognized and championed by governance. Then you may move to a managed CMM level state 4, and that's a necessity for robust quantitative metrics to support project interdependencies and overall health. And some of us eventually get to an optimized level. I've been lucky enough to build a couple of departments where we got to level 5, not without a lot of heartache and pain, I must admit, where we utilize business goals vis-a-vis the strategic plan. We utilize our budgetary and resource constraints on an ongoing basis to maximize portfolio value, that is, to not leave value on the table. Now, here's another MODA model. Look, I've introduced you to MODA, Multiple Objective Decision Analysis, that I use to help organizations, including some of my previous ones that I work for internally, create a sense of where they are. And I essentially do this over 7 major metrics so that all have their hidden sub-attributes, much as we did for the benefit, risk, cost, and time model that had, in fact, a total of 8 sub-attributes. The only one I've blown up is this analytical and organizational capabilities, looking at 7 sub-attributes. And what I would do is gather a team of stakeholders in a portfolio management session with an evolving or a fledgling portfolio management department, and they would do their own scoring, which I would challenge, and we would generate weighted aggregate scores for their particular current state. Not surprisingly, I would end up with a spider that looks a bit like this. So this says, in terms of the one that I was looking at just now, analytical and organizational capabilities, or in fact our current state is at a level 2. We really wish to get to level 5. But the problem is, what's it going to take for you to get to level 5? What resources will you apply? What expertise will you hire? And how much time will you allocate to getting there? That gap, that delta between the 2 and the 5 is what defines a transition plan that needs to be created to actually close that gap. One may look, on the other hand, at management control and governance structure, and here the current state is exactly the same as the desired state in the future. This organization feels no compulsion to get any higher. You don't always have to strive to a level 5, okay, to put it another way. Now, what this boils down to is the 3 executive management colors that most folks like. That is green, yellow, and red, and I know most, if not all of you on the phone, know those 3 colors well for your senior decision makers. Okay, I create something called a heptagonal wheel that looks at where you're doing well, so for example, management control and governance structure, and where you're not doing so well at all, for example, analytical and organizational capabilities, and then we address the question, so what are we going to do about it? How long will we take to close the gap? What's the transition plan? Now, before I get to my penultimate slide, there's a question that I wish to address. So the question says, I think it is key that all project characterization data is collected by the same team instead of different teams per project. Do you agree? The answer is yes and no. Oh, it is very difficult in most organizations to have the same team collect the data, but I know exactly why you're asking the question. So this is, again, a most important question. You are most concerned about data that, in fact, could be elaborated, made more optimistic, made more pessimistic, just to suit the needs of the team that are gathering the data. What I generally do is I have different teams who are trained in the same way, essentially collect data, but we then have a data vetting session, a vetting session that goes across all projects, where all project data and information are fairly presented, and the governance committee for that data vetting session then tries to make the data more robust by picking holes into the assumptions, the data, the criteria, the forecasts. So if you have an organization where you have a single team that's collecting data, that's great. There are many places where you don't have that luxury. You have multiple teams doing it, but the key is to have a data vetting committee to help validate and rationalize the data. So hopefully I've been able to address that question. Now to my penultimate slide. Here are a few words of wisdom based on my 15 years of experience. No matter how good you are, you need a visible champion who can help you avoid minefields, many of which are not self-evident. You need a sponsor who can basically help you to navigate through an organization that may or may not be very disciplined, and most organizations are not. In fact, to assist you in avoiding minefields that could simply blow away your most well-intentioned expectations. You may need to walk the square with stakeholders to understand what they stand to gain or lose by your efforts. Do not be surprised if, by trying to implement portfolio management, you essentially threaten the domain of others in your organization. I won't specifically bring out or call out the name of one or other department. I know that in the 15 years I've spent internal to organizations, I have unknowingly threatened the domain of other organizations, so you need to be careful. Not other organizations, other departments within my organizations. Without the appropriate frame and scope, your efforts can overlap with others, create doubts, and eventually become marginalized. Make sure there's a good meeting of the minds between what it is that you are tasked with doing, what you'll create, and what other folks will create, and how you'll become interdependent, not basically tripping over each other, trying to get the same thing done differently. You need to understand the cultural predispositions of your organization so you apply the right level of process, methodology, and analytics to enable good decision-making under risk and uncertainty. And here's what I'm going to underscore. Applying the right level of process, methodology, and analytics. Nowhere in this presentation did I say give them creopum in its most undiluted form. Not correct. You need to understand what the organization is culturally predisposed to accept, and then what level of process, methodology, and analytics you will basically provide. Create a capability step function that allows you to demonstrate the value you add or the value your organization is missing out on along the way. Lastly, you generally have one good shot at portfolio management. So please ensure you prepare the turf well before you take your first steps. Now this is my final slide. And so before I get to your final questions, I'd simply like to thank you for your time and attention. I hope I've managed to keep you all awake. Even if we don't have enough time today to answer questions, I'm more than amenable to responding to an email or two. And if folks, well, here's my email address. If folks would wish to contact me just to get clarification on something I said or didn't say, if I've created any ambiguity, I'd be more than happy to actually follow up with an email or two.
Richard, do you have any further questions that have come through your side?
Yes, I have one, an interesting one about how about projects that are interlinked. That is an interesting question, and the way to treat this technically and correctly is not to treat them separately, but to treat interlinked projects as a program. We didn't have the opportunity to discuss how a program is distinguished from a project, but because of what is called interlinking or interdependencies, they could be interdependent because of commercial value, because of risk, because of resource interdependencies or resource allocation. Those projects need to be treated as a program for portfolio selection. By the way, you cannot prioritize projects versus programs. You can only optimize the portfolio with the inclusion of both projects and programs. Then there is another question, are we talking about scenarios? We could. So what a scenario could be is, should we actually look at a program of 3 or 4 interdependent projects or 1 or 2 projects that have no connectivity whatsoever? Yes, you could do good scenario analysis, and the best way to do this is using the optimization frame that I described earlier, not prioritization. One cannot and should not prioritize a program against a project. Okay, I have one other question, if I may continue, Mark, and I'll let you decide.
Yep, that's fine.
So this is a very good question. How do you prioritize projects across divisions that may have different strategic objectives but draw from the same resource pool? So you've already outlined, okay, the basis on which projects need to be prioritized. You're using the same resources. They could be from different divisions, but you have to use the same criteria for project prioritization because you're pulling from the same common pool of resources. You can't have Division A saying, we'll prioritize an NPV, and Division B saying, we'll prioritize on strategic value or customer satisfaction, and still pull from the same resources because there's no common way of actually looking or equating that project from Division A versus that project from Division B. There's nothing wrong with prioritizing projects from different divisions, just as long as you use the same criteria and methodology for prioritization. Now, I hope that answers the question.
If you'd like to influence the future direction of the webinar series, you can tell us what you think on generic or topic-related issues by completing our short survey. This can be found at www.pure-insight.com/webinars/survey. With over 36 webinars per year, we cover the spectrum of current new product development and innovation issues. You can find out more details of forthcoming sessions at pure-insight.com/webinars. If you have bought a single seat for today's session, you may like to be made aware that significant savings can be made by joining our annual webinar subscription package. This allows individuals, groups or site subscribers to get free access to a year's worth of webinars and the ability to download the recordings of any sessions that they miss if they're busy on the original day of transmission. If you would like to know more about subscribing, please email sales@pure-insight.com or telephone us on +44 1325 329 870. For details of our archive webinars and previous sessions, please visit pure-insight.com/webinars/previous. Thank you for participating today. This webinar is now closed.